Hey guys, tonight we're going to journey back to a time when smiles were a rare and almost dangerous expression. Picture this. It's the middle of the 14th century, and you're a peasant living in medieval Europe. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, and the world around you is a patchwork of mud huts and stone fortresses. The sun barely peeks through the endless clouds, and the only thing you can hear is the wind howling through the trees, mixed with the faint sounds of cattle lowing in the distance. Now, imagine living in a world where every day feels like an uphill battle just to survive. A world where joy is practically a foreign concept, and smiling could get you accused of witchcraft. Sounds bleak, right? You probably won't survive this if you catch a cold. But let's hope we're just looking at a few centuries in the past rather than the actual risks of medieval life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments below? I'm always curious about where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval Europe was a place where survival, not happiness, was the ultimate goal. For peasants who made up the majority of the population, the world was often a series of daily struggles against the harshness of nature, disease, and social inequality. To smile, well, that wasn't something you did lightly. Life was precarious. One year, you might have a bountiful harvest. The next, famine could strike, leaving you scrambling for scraps. The feudal system meant that peasants were tied to the land, working for their lords, often under harsh conditions. The idea of leisure, or even basic comfort, was practically non-existent. And that wasn't even the worst of it. If you were a peasant in this world, you didn't have time for happiness. Between the endless work in the fields, the constant threat of plagues, and the social structure that kept you in a perpetual state of subjugation, there was little space to enjoy life. People didn't smile. They didn't laugh much either. Every day was about survival, and every moment that wasn't spent working was a moment closer to death. The constant awareness of how fragile life was led to a culture where happiness seemed almost foreign, a fleeting thought, quickly dismissed. Peasants didn't just live in difficult conditions, they were born into them. Social mobility was nearly impossible. Your family's status was your destiny, and your life would likely be a carbon copy of your parents' lives. Your job was determined before you were even old enough to walk, and you'd spend the rest of your days working the land or performing menial tasks for your lord. And while the aristocracy might live in stone castles, wearing fine clothes and feasting on meats and wines, the peasants would eat whatever scraps they could find, if they found anything at all. For many, survival was a miracle in itself, let alone enjoying anything in life. Historians still argue whether peasants were more resilient because of these hardships or simply resigned to their fate. But what's clear is that life was hard and joy was scarce. In a world where happiness seemed like a luxury, peasants learned to live without it. In fact, they often believed that to smile or to show joy was a kind of weakness, a sign that you weren't fully aware of how grim things really were. Imagine, for a moment, that you're stuck in a cycle of plague, famine, and war, with little more than a few meager belongings and an aching back from endless labor. Life for peasants in medieval Europe wasn't just a matter of hard work. It was a constant battle for survival. Plagues would sweep through villages, decimating entire communities in a matter of weeks. Famine would follow, sometimes lasting years, leaving the soil barren and the people desperate. And then there was the ever-present threat of war, where knights and soldiers clashed over land and power, leaving villages in ruins. Yet, through all of this, smiling wasn't just rare, it was practically forbidden. Plague. The word alone evokes images of death, sickness, and helplessness. And in the medieval era, it was an ever-present specter that haunted every part of life. The Black Death, one of the most infamous pandemics in history, killed millions across Europe. Entire villages were wiped off the map in the span of months, and those who survived often did so by sheer luck. People didn't just die from the plague, they died slowly, painfully, and often alone. There were no medicines, no cures, and certainly no comfort in the face of such a tragedy. Famine wasn't far behind. Medieval Europe was an agrarian society, and when crops failed, the consequences were devastating. The weather was unpredictable. Harsh winters and soggy summers ruined harvests, and grain prices would skyrocket, making even basic food items unaffordable. The result was widespread starvation, especially among the peasants. In times of scarcity, people had to make do with whatever they could find. We're talking about a diet consisting of mostly bread, gruel, and occasionally meat, if you were lucky. Then there was the constant state of war. Lords fought over territory, often sending peasants to the battlefield as little more than cannon fodder. Peasants had no say in these matters. Wars were fought by the aristocracy, but the burden of those wars fell squarely on the working class. During battles, villages were often looted, burned, and left in ruin. And when soldiers weren't fighting, they were robbing the local populace, leaving the peasants to fend for themselves once again. Historians still argue whether peasants in medieval Europe were more affected by the physical dangers of the time, like plagues and famine, or the psychological toll of living in constant fear. What's clear, though, is that the environment they lived in was one that didn't allow for much happiness. People were too focused on simply getting through the day to even consider smiling. Each passing moment was another step towards survival or death, and joy was something that seemed too far removed from their grim reality. In a time when so much was out of a peasant's control, the only thing that mattered was getting through the day. Joy, if it existed at all, was fleeting. A fleeting luxury for those who had the time and resources to enjoy it, not for those struggling to stay alive. With the ever-looming threats of plague, famine, and war, it's no wonder that smiles were few and far between. Now, let's shift our focus a bit. Imagine living in a world where every rustling leaf, every shadow, and every unexpected noise sends a jolt of fear through your body. Medieval peasants didn't just fear the obvious threats like disease, famine, and war. They lived in constant fear of the supernatural, the unseen, the things that couldn't be explained. Superstition wasn't just part of life. It was a way of life. And that fear? It didn't leave much room for smiles. The world was full of omens, witches, demons, and divine punishment. And to show joy could very well be seen as an invitation for disaster. In medieval Europe, superstition ran deep. You couldn't sneeze without someone muttering a prayer to protect you from the evil spirits that were thought to be behind such simple actions. You couldn't walk under a tree without fearing that you might anger some forest spirit, or cross a black cat without bracing yourself for 7 years of bad luck. The very notion of stepping out into the world was fraught with potential dangers. And these dangers weren't just physical. They were spiritual, mystical, and often intangible. You could go to bed healthy one night and wake up the next day with an illness that was seen as a curse, a punishment for some unknown transgression. Historians still argue whether superstition was a way to explain the uncontrollable or a means of maintaining power over the masses. What is certain, however, is that for the average peasant, the supernatural was an inescapable reality. It shaped their every thought and action. The fear of witches was especially prevalent. The church was deeply invested in the idea that witches were real, and they were often blamed for misfortune, disease, or crop failures. Trials for witchcraft were common, and many peasants, especially women, were accused and executed based on little more than hearsay and suspicion. It was believed that witches could cast spells, cause sickness, and even summon demons. The mere thought of a witch in your village could cause panic, and the consequences of being accused were often fatal. Alongside witches, there were countless other fears that permeated daily life. Evil spirits, omens, and bad luck haunted the medieval mind. If a crow landed on your roof, it was a sign of impending death. If you spilled salt, you had to throw a pinch over your left shoulder to ward off misfortune. Every action, every event, no matter how small, carried weight and meaning. And when your life was constantly under the influence of unseen forces, how could you possibly feel free to smile? Fear consumed every waking moment, and joy felt like an indulgence reserved for those who weren't concerned with staying safe. The influence of religion in these superstitions was undeniable. The church, which held immense power in medieval Europe, not only offered salvation, but also preached a culture of fear. Heaven and hell were real places, and if you didn't live in accordance with the strict moral code set out by the church, you were at risk of eternal damnation. This notion of divine punishment was terrifying. It was easy to see how someone might view a smile, or any expression of joy, as a sign of moral laxity. After all, how could you be happy in a world so fraught with danger? How could you smile when your soul might be at risk? But there were also darker fears that extended beyond religion. The peasant's world was one where resources were scarce, and any hint of happiness or success could invite the envy of others. In a time when jealousy could lead to accusations of witchcraft, having a moment of joy could be seen as an act of defiance, one that might bring wrath down upon you. Smiles, laughter, and moments of levity were dangerous because they made you stand out. They made you different, and that difference could invite suspicion or worse. Historians still debate whether superstitions like these were just a natural part of medieval life, or whether they were a tool used by the church and aristocracy to keep the peasants in check. Either way, the result was the same. Life was terrifying. You lived in a constant state of fear, where joy was something that might just attract disaster. So, you kept your head down, worked hard, and tried not to provoke the forces that could ruin your life. Smiling was not a luxury. It was a potential threat. All right, now, let's get our hands a bit dirtier, shall we? Imagine that every single day, from the moment you wake up to the moment you collapse into bed at night, is spent working your body into the ground, literally. For peasants in medieval Europe, the concept of leisure was as foreign as a smile. There was no time for relaxation, no weekend getaways, and certainly no spa days. The only thing that mattered was getting the work done, and there was always more work to be done. The day would begin at the crack of dawn, when the first rays of sunlight barely lit the horizon. You'd probably stumble out of bed, groggy and stiff from a night spent on a hard straw mattress, your back already aching from yesterday's labor. Then it was off to work, whether it was tilling the fields, caring for animals, or performing countless other menial tasks to keep the household running. And this was no 9-to-5 job. Oh no, this was from sunup to sundown, 7 days a week, year in and year out. There was no time for a lazy Sunday. In fact, the very concept of free time didn't exist. There wasn't even time to stop for a proper meal. Instead, lunch was often just a hasty bite of bread, a bowl of thin soup, or perhaps a few scraps if you were lucky. The only rest you could expect was during the long winter months, when the land was covered in snow and the work slowed to a crawl. But even then, it wasn't exactly restful. You had to mend tools, prepare for the next season's planting, or deal with the constant maintenance of your home. And while you're working tirelessly to ensure your survival, what are you supposed to smile about? Historians still argue whether the rigid, demanding lifestyle of medieval peasants made them more resilient or simply broken. Some believe that the constant work, without any real respite, created a stoic sense of endurance in the peasants, while others think that it drove them into a state of emotional numbness, unable to experience happiness or satisfaction in their day-to-day lives. Either way, one thing is clear: smiles were not a common sight. Now, let's think about the physical toll this work took on a peasant's body. You're not just sitting at a desk or typing on a keyboard. No, you're spending hours plowing the fields with crude tools, chopping wood, hauling water, or tending livestock. Every muscle in your body aches from the repetitive motions. Your skin becomes calloused and worn from the constant exposure to the elements. Your back is perpetually sore from bending and lifting heavy loads, and your hands, well, they're rough and cracked from years of hard labor. And that's if you don't get injured. A cut or wound could easily become infected, and without modern medicine, you could be at risk of losing a limb or even your life. All this labor meant that there was no time for fun, for play, or even for a moment's peace. Even the rare moments when work might slow down, during harvest or on a holiday, were still filled with chores. The peasants had no time to sit back and relax, no time to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. They were too busy just trying to get through the day, too focused on the physical exertion required to survive. In this harsh, relentless reality, there was no room for smiles. And if that wasn't enough, let's talk about the toll that this lifestyle took on your spirit. Imagine working tirelessly day after day with little to show for it, knowing that your efforts might not even guarantee survival. You could spend all year planting crops, only to have them wiped out by a sudden frost or a flood. You could work from dawn until dusk and still struggle to feed your family. The mental exhaustion of living in such uncertainty, of knowing that every day could be your last, would wear you down. Smiling in this environment wasn't just rare, it felt impossible. Historians still debate whether the intense work culture of medieval peasants served as a form of community bonding, or if it simply crushed the human spirit. One thing is for certain: their lives were far from easy, and a smile was not something they could afford, either physically or emotionally. Now that we've seen just how exhausting and relentless life was for peasants, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the hierarchy that governed their every move. Medieval Europe wasn't a place where people could easily escape their social class. It was a rigid feudal society, where your life's work and status were determined before you even took your first breath. And in this hierarchy, peasants were at the bottom, with their lives completely controlled by the lords and landowners above them. The structure was so entrenched that it didn't just dictate what you did. It dictated how you felt, how you interacted with others, and yes, even whether or not you could smile. Feudalism was essentially a system that ensured that the majority of people, peasants, worked to support the minority, landlords, knights, and the nobility. If you were a peasant, you didn't own land. You didn't own anything, really. The land you worked on, the house you lived in, even the food you ate were all under the control of someone else. You didn't have the luxury of choosing your occupation either. You were tied to the land. If you were born to work the fields, you worked the fields. If you were born to serve in the Lord's household, that was your role. The land was controlled by the lords, the very people who kept peasants in a constant state of dependency. The lords were the ones who decided what crops were grown, what taxes were paid, and what labor was expected. They also decided what could or could not be done in the village, and they held the power to punish, even execute, peasants who stepped out of line. In this tightly controlled environment, the idea of personal agency was practically non-existent. Historians still debate whether feudalism was simply an effective way to organize society, or whether it was a tool of oppression meant to maintain control over the lower classes. Either way, it didn't leave much room for anything resembling happiness. Smiling in a society like this was seen as frivolous, a sign of indulgence, a gesture reserved for those who didn't understand the harsh realities of life. Peasants had no time to smile. They had no time to even think about it. The social control didn't stop with work. It extended into every area of life. Peasants had little say in matters like marriage, property, and even religion. Their lives were controlled by the nobility, the church, and the local laws, with no room for personal expression or happiness. The rigid structure of feudalism kept peasants firmly in their place, and there was little hope of climbing the social ladder. Even the idea of upward mobility was almost laughable. You were born into your role, and you stayed there. What does this mean for our peasants? It meant that they were never free to smile in the way we might think of today. Smiling was an expression of freedom, of happiness, of individualism, and none of those were available to the medieval peasant. Even a moment of joy, a simple smile, could have been perceived as an act of rebellion. To smile would have been to show an emotion that wasn't acceptable in a world where survival was the only goal. Historians still argue whether the strict, unyielding nature of the feudal system actually helped maintain order and stability, or whether it simply crushed the spirit of the peasant. What is clear, however, is that the peasants' lives were governed by the rules and demands of others, with little room for any sort of personal expression, especially something as trivial as smiling. By now, we've seen how difficult life was for medieval peasants. Harsh labor, no personal agency, constant fear of disease and war, and a rigid social hierarchy that left no room for happiness. But there was one force that permeated all aspects of their lives and added another layer of pressure: religion. The church was more than just a place of worship. It was a dominating power that controlled nearly every part of a peasant's existence. And while religion promised salvation in the afterlife, it also brought with it a heavy burden of fear, guilt, and the constant threat of damnation. In this environment, it's no surprise that a smile, an outward expression of joy, was nearly impossible. The church in medieval Europe was a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't just a religious institution, it was a political and social power that dictated laws, customs, and morality. The priests were not just religious leaders, they were also local authorities. They were the ones who administered sacraments, decided the fate of souls, and had the power to excommunicate people from the community. The concept of eternal salvation or damnation was ever present in the minds of the peasants. Your entire life was shaped by the belief that your actions on earth would determine your place in heaven, or, if you weren't careful, your descent into hell. Historians still debate whether the medieval church's role in controlling the lives of peasants was one of spiritual guidance or one of manipulation. Some argue that the church kept society in check, providing comfort and meaning in a world full of suffering. Others believe the church used its influence to maintain the power of the aristocracy and control the masses. Regardless of the intention, the effect was the same. Peasants lived in constant fear of divine retribution, and that fear was not conducive to happiness. A smile? Well, that could be a dangerous thing. Medieval Christianity taught that joy and pleasure were temptations of the flesh, distractions from the true path of righteousness. In fact, happiness was often seen as a sign of moral weakness or pride. A smile, in this context, could be interpreted as frivolous or even sinful. The church's teachings emphasized self-denial, suffering, and devotion to God, qualities that didn't leave much room for joy. To smile was to risk appearing too comfortable, too satisfied with the world around you, and that was a dangerous sentiment in a society so focused on the fear of sin. In addition to the fear of eternal punishment, the church's influence also meant that peasants were constantly reminded of their inferiority. The vast wealth of the clergy and nobility contrasted sharply with the poverty of the peasants, creating a sense of guilt for even the smallest enjoyment. There was a pervasive belief that wealth and pleasure were inherently sinful, and that only through suffering could a person achieve salvation. The idea of indulging in happiness, or even showing a hint of it through a smile, was seen as a temptation to be avoided. Remember that time we talked about the superstition that a smile might bring disaster? Well, the church shared in this view. While the belief in witches and omens might seem disconnected from religious teachings, they were often rooted in the same fear of spiritual purity. To smile was to potentially disrupt the balance between this world and the next. Peasants, under the guidance of their priests, were reminded daily that their suffering on earth was a test. Their reward would come after death, and they needed to remain vigilant in avoiding temptations of the flesh. And joy was a prime example of such temptation. Historians still argue whether the medieval church's influence over peasants was a means of spiritual salvation or a way to maintain control. But one thing is certain: it didn't foster an environment where smiling was encouraged. With heaven and hell hanging in the balance, happiness seemed frivolous, and joy was something that could easily be seen as a distraction from what truly mattered: devotion, piety, and fear of divine judgment. Let's take a moment to consider something a bit more curious. In medieval Europe, the very act of smiling wasn't just rare, it was downright suspicious. Remember how we talked about the constant fear of sin and punishment, and how this kept peasants' lives joyless and grim? Well, things were so tightly controlled that showing any sign of happiness, such as a smile, was not only discouraged, but often perceived as a sign of moral weakness. In a world where stoicism and self-denial were the norms, the very idea of enjoying life felt improper. In fact, a smile could be seen as a form of indulgence, something sinful and undesirable. In medieval Christianity, joy was often associated with earthly pleasures, which were inherently seen as corrupt or distracting. The more a person smiled, the more they might be viewed as being too attached to the material world, too focused on fleeting pleasures, and too detached from their true spiritual calling. The concept of joyful suffering was central to many teachings. The idea was that if you endured hardship, you would earn your reward in the afterlife. To smile, to laugh, was to show that you weren't suffering enough, that you hadn't yet fully embraced your place in the grand scheme of things. Historians still debate whether this cultural aversion to happiness was a reflection of medieval Christianity's teachings on self-discipline, or whether it was a wider societal norm, born from centuries of constant hardship. Either way, the reality for the peasants was clear. Smiling was seen as something to be avoided. In a society where suffering was equated with virtue, smiling was a dangerous act of rebellion. To be seen smiling in public could even be grounds for suspicion. What if you were hiding something? What if you were too content, too detached from the harshness of life? As you can imagine, for a peasant this wasn't just a philosophical issue, it had real-world consequences. The social and moral pressure to maintain a stern, serious demeanor was intense. People feared being labeled as morally lax, or worse, as unworthy of salvation. In a world that was primarily focused on survival, the very act of smiling became a subversive and potentially dangerous act. Now, let's bring this idea into the larger cultural context. If you've ever wondered why the medieval period is often depicted as dark and gloomy, filled with gloomy faces and stone-cold expressions, this is a big part of the reason. It wasn't just about the daily grind, the constant threat of famine, or the ever-present fear of disease. It was also about cultural and religious norms that taught people to suppress their emotions, especially their joy. In the eyes of the church, smiles were not a sign of happiness, but a symbol of indulgence, the kind of indulgence that could lead to damnation. As harsh as this sounds, the medieval attitude towards smiling was a reflection of the world in which peasants lived. Every aspect of their lives was shaped by fear: fear of divine punishment, fear of social exclusion, fear of the unknown. There was no space in this world for frivolity, and certainly no room for what we now think of as enjoying life. The pursuit of happiness, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist for medieval peasants. Smiling wasn't something to be embraced. It was something to be avoided at all costs. Historians still argue whether medieval society's deep distrust of joy was a reflection of the religious worldview that dominated the period, or whether it was a more universal cultural response to centuries of suffering and hardship. But one thing is clear: smiles were few and far between, especially for the peasants who bore the brunt of that hardship. Let's now turn our attention to an often overlooked group in medieval society, the peasant women. The challenges faced by medieval peasants were difficult enough for men, but for women, the burdens were even greater. They didn't just work the land or tend the household. They also had to endure a set of expectations that were even more rigid and oppressive. Life for a peasant woman was an endless cycle of physical labor, with little regard for her emotional well-being. And with these expectations came an even greater restriction on the possibility of joy or smiling. Her world was defined by hardship, exhaustion, and limited choices, leaving little room for anything like happiness or pleasure. From the moment they were born, peasant girls were expected to perform the same work as the boys. But once they reached adolescence, they were also expected to take on the added responsibility of child rearing. Marriage was usually arranged early, and the prospect of having a family was a given. In the harsh reality of medieval life, it wasn't unusual for women to give birth multiple times, only to see many of their children die from disease or malnutrition. The survival rate for infants was low, and mothers were often caught in the cycle of grief and sorrow as they buried child after child. Historians still debate whether the role of peasant women in medieval society was a reflection of societal necessity or a sign of gendered oppression. But either way, it's clear that the emotional toll of living in such a brutal world left little space for happiness. Women's lives were defined by their ability to endure and their constant labor, and their worth was often measured by how much they could bear without complaint. Smiling wasn't something you did when your body was constantly pregnant, exhausted from work, or mourning the loss of children. It wasn't something you did when your existence was tied to the whims of your husband or the lord who controlled your land. It wasn't something you did when survival was all-consuming. If women had any personal happiness, it was rarely acknowledged or even allowed. Their labor was meant to be selfless. Everything they did was for the family, the community, and the Lord. There was no space for self-care or personal joy. Women were expected to find meaning in sacrifice, and to express anything else was, frankly, seen as indulgent. Smiling wasn't a luxury they could afford. The daily toll of their lives left little room for pleasure, and even less room for personal expression. The lack of agency that women had in this environment was also evident in their roles within the religious structure of medieval society. The church, which dictated so much of the social and moral life, offered little respite to women. While men could hold power as priests, bishops, and even kings, women were relegated to roles that were seen as less significant. Even when they entered religious life, they were often consigned to cloisters, where their work was still centered around service and sacrifice. Their joy, if it existed, was a private affair, if they could even find it amidst their daily struggles. Historians still argue whether medieval society's treatment of women was a product of cultural norms or religious doctrine. Either way, it's evident that peasant women lived a life that was marked by hardship, duty, and sacrifice. Smiling, for them, wasn't a form of celebration. It was an act of defiance, one that could easily be misinterpreted as a sign of disrespect or failure to understand their place in society. With so much expected of them, there was no time to smile, let alone enjoy life. As we've journeyed through the grim realities of medieval life for peasants, we begin to understand why smiles were so rare, if they existed at all. Between the constant struggle for survival, the heavy weight of superstition, the unyielding grip of the church, and the brutal demands of their social system, happiness seemed like a distant, unattainable luxury. But there's something about this historical narrative that echoes through time. The suffering of medieval peasants has shaped modern perceptions of happiness, and the shadow of that suffering lingers, influencing our approach to joy, fulfillment, and the pursuit of happiness even today. In many ways, the medieval period is where our modern understanding of suffering and happiness began to take root. The idea that happiness is earned, often at the cost of hardship, continues to influence how we approach life. It's as if the suffering of peasants in the past set a precedent for how we think about joy in the present, something that can only be truly appreciated after enduring pain and struggle. There is an almost ingrained cultural belief that happiness must be earned through hard work or sacrifice, a notion that we carry with us from the Middle Ages. But, of course, there's also a shift in how we think about happiness today. In modern times, we're encouraged to seek joy, pursue pleasure, and embrace self-care. There's an increasing recognition that happiness is not just a byproduct of surviving hardship, but something that can and should be cultivated regardless of circumstances. However, the lingering effects of medieval thought still shape our attitudes. We still tend to see happiness as something fleeting, something that can be easily lost if we're not careful. This belief is a direct echo of a time when joy was seen as indulgent, dangerous, and perhaps too frivolous for those whose lives were filled with suffering. It's fascinating in a way how our modern pursuit of happiness has evolved from the darkest parts of history. We've gone from a society that actively suppressed joy to one that recognizes its importance, yet still feels the weight of centuries of cultural conditioning that tells us joy should be fleeting, not constant. This tension between suffering and joy is something that continues to play out in our lives, often without us even realizing it. As we look back on the lives of those medieval peasants, we might feel pity for their hardships, but we can also take away a valuable lesson. They endured what most of us today would find unimaginable, yet in their resilience we can find inspiration. They didn't smile, not because they didn't want to, but because their world didn't allow them to. And in that perhaps lies a lesson for us. Joy, when it comes, is precious, but it should never be something that's earned only through pain. It's not a reward for suffering, but a part of life in and of itself. As we end this journey through history, let's remind ourselves that the smiles of today, the moments of happiness that we often take for granted, come from a very different world than the one peasants knew. And though we may still struggle in our own ways, we have the freedom to smile when we choose, to laugh when we want, and to embrace joy without guilt. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, let the weight of history fall away and allow yourself the simple gift of a smile, something our ancestors could only dream of.